I still remember the exact moment my brother's words hit me like a punch I couldn't dodge. We were on the phone, and his voice was sharp, cold, and completely devoid of any kindness. "You're pathetic," he said, each syllable dripping with contempt. "Don't even think about coming for Thanksgiving. We don't need you there." I froze, my hands tightening around the phone as if gripping it could somehow hold back the wave of shame and hurt that was rushing over me. I wanted to argue, to scream, to beg him to reconsider, but nothing came out. I could feel the humiliation curling in my chest, wrapping around my heart, squeezing it tight. The thought that my own brother had completely dismissed me, my presence, my value, left me staggering, silence stretched on the line, both of us knowing this wasn't just a casual insult. It was a verdict. I hung up slowly, my hand trembling, and for a long moment, I just stared at the wall, feeling smaller than I had ever felt before. The warmth and laughter of family gatherings I had once cherished now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a hollow ache. And yet, beneath the pain, a strange clarity began to form. I wouldn't go to Thanksgiving. Not this year, but this rejection, this belittlement, was planting a seed, and I knew, somehow, that this wasn't the end of the story. As I quietly turned away, I could already feel the subtle stirring of a plan, one that would make him regret underestimating me. Growing up, it was always like I was living in the shadows of my brother, though everyone else seemed blind to it. Mom would heap praise on him for the smallest achievements, an A on a test, a soccer goal, a polite word to a neighbor, while my successes were quietly acknowledged at best, or ignored altogether. Even as a child, I noticed the way his opinion carried weight, how my efforts seemed invisible. And then there were the insults, subtle at first, like whispers that planted doubt in my own mind. "You're too slow," he'd say, or, "Why can't you be more like me?" At first, I tried to brush them off, convincing myself he was just teasing, but the words accumulated, shaping the way I saw myself. Family projects, holidays, even birthdays, he was always first in line for attention, first in line for praise, first in line for inheritance or favor, and I was left behind, silently smarting, silently calculating. I wasn't just the overlooked sibling, I was the one everyone underestimated. Deep down, I had skills and intelligence that went unnoticed, ideas that could move mountains if anyone ever bothered to listen. But my brother, oblivious and arrogant, never saw me as a threat. Every slight, every moment of favoritism, every betrayal of trust layered on top of the last, quietly sharpening a part of me he would never suspect, my ability to wait, to observe, and to plan. And though it hurt, I also knew that these experiences were teaching me something crucial: patience, strategy, and the quiet power of being underestimated. After that Thanksgiving call, I started paying closer attention to my brother. Not in a nosy way, but with a new sense of clarity. I noticed the way he flaunted his wealth without thought, driving his fancy car recklessly through quiet streets, bragging about his new gadgets as if they defined his worth. He lived for appearances, for approval from everyone except me, and it was astonishing how careless he truly was. Bills were always his least concern, deadlines ignored, obligations shrugged off as if someone else would magically fix them. The arrogance was thick in every word he spoke, the entitlement in every glance he threw around. And yet, as I observed, a different perspective began to form in my mind. His carelessness wasn't just irritating, it was an opportunity. Each boast, each reckless move, each time he assumed I would never notice or interfere, planted seeds for what I was beginning to consider: a plan. I could see the weak spots, the cracks beneath his polished surface, the dependencies he assumed were invisible. And though it made my chest ache to think about him in such a calculating way, I knew that understanding these habits, these vulnerabilities, was the first step toward turning the tables. For the first time, I realized that his confidence was a fragile mask, and when the right moment came, it could shatter spectacularly. That night, as I sat alone, the house quiet except for the distant hum of traffic, I made a choice that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I wouldn't go to Thanksgiving. Not this year, not ever again if I didn't want to. But more than that, I realized there was a way to reclaim a sense of power I had been denied my whole life. My brother, so used to being untouchable, relied on the assumption that I would never interfere with his life, his finances, or his carefully curated image of superiority. That arrogance was his blind spot. I began mapping it out in my mind. His rent, his mortgage, the bank accounts he bragged about. A simple adjustment here, a quiet redirection there, and suddenly, the world he thought he controlled wouldn't be so stable. I imagined the subtle panic on his face, the disbelief as he realized that someone he dismissed as weak, pathetic even, had quietly altered the game. FOMO settled over me like a cloak. I knew he would never see it coming, never anticipate that the powerless sibling could wield influence so quietly, so efficiently. Every detail of his entitlement, every careless decision he made, became a potential lever for justice. I didn't need fireworks or confrontation. The thrill would be in the silence, in watching his confidence crumble while he remained oblivious to the hand that had shifted everything beneath him. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I wasn't just skipping a meal. I was preparing a reckoning he couldn't yet comprehend. The day I put my plan into motion, my hands shook just enough to remind me this was real. I had spent weeks quietly redirecting a few key payments, ensuring that the money my brother relied on for his rent would never reach its destination. It was precise, legal, and invisible. He wouldn't suspect a thing until the due date loomed. When the emails from his landlord started bouncing back, when the notices piled up, I could almost hear the disbelief in his voice before it even happened. I caught myself smiling, a little too wide, and immediately felt a pang of guilt. Was this cruel? Was I crossing a line I shouldn't? Yet the memory of his sneer, of the word pathetic rolling off his tongue, made the moral hesitation feel smaller, less significant. The satisfaction bubbled beneath the surface, a quiet thrill that I was finally seen. Not for what I had failed to be, but for the cunning I had always possessed. Still, a flicker of fear ran through me. What if he found out it was me? What if this backfired? But as I watched from a distance, knowing I had exposed his carelessness and entitlement without anyone else being harmed, the fear softened into pride. He had assumed power was his alone, that I was inconsequential, and yet here he was, scrambling, off balance, uncertain. The tables had shifted, and for the first time in years I felt the weight of control in my own hands. This was only the beginning, I reminded myself, but it was a sweet, intoxicating beginning. It didn't take long for the ripple effects of my actions to reach the rest of the family. Casual conversations suddenly carried tension. Aunts and cousins exchanged uneasy glances when his name came up. I overheard whispers about late payments, frantic calls, and a sense of disbelief that this usually untouchable brother could be faltering. Part of me wanted to speak, to explain, to own the satisfaction of his predicament, but I stayed quiet. I had spent years being dismissed, being invisible, and now, watching from the sidelines, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. The contrast was sharp and almost painful in its clarity. The sibling who had once been ridiculed, brushed aside and humiliated, was now calm, composed, and observing the one who had tormented me struggle. My distance made it all the more striking, emphasizing the reversal. I could see him pacing, calling people, even attempting to charm sympathy from relatives who had never seen him falter. Every flustered word, every stumble, every anxious gesture was a reminder of the power shift. I felt a mixture of empathy, pride, and a flicker of guilt, but above all, a quiet satisfaction that, for the first time, I held the upper hand. This was not just revenge. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the unexpected strength of the underestimated. By the third day, the cracks in my brother's carefully maintained facade were impossible to ignore. I watched him corner relatives on the phone, his voice a mix of panic and false charm, trying desperately to spin the situation in his favor. "It's just a misunderstanding," he'd say, over-explaining, hoping to elicit sympathy, hoping someone would bail him out. He was used to bending people to his will, manipulating and shaming them into compliance. But this time, no one seemed fully convinced. I felt a strange tug of empathy. After all, he was my brother. But it was tempered by every insult he'd ever hurled, every time he'd ignored my successes, every sneer that had branded me as pathetic. His arrogance had always made him blind, but now it made him reckless, and I could see it unraveling in real time. Each failed plea, each strained excuse made the tension thicken like a storm cloud about to break. I stayed quiet, letting him stumble, letting the consequences of his entitlement ripple outward. And yet, beneath my satisfaction, a flicker of unease crept in. Could he recover from this? Could he find some hidden maneuver to regain control and undo everything I had quietly orchestrated? The thought sent a shiver through me, because even with all the planning, one misstep, one unexpected move on his part could change everything. The uncertainty hung in the air, a silent countdown to what would happen next. It was during a casual family brunch, the kind of gathering that usually involved polite laughter and exaggerated compliments, that I finally saw the perfect opportunity. My brother, still flustered from missed payments and desperate calls, was holding court, trying to impress everyone with his supposed control over life and finances. I waited patiently, sipping my coffee, letting him talk, letting him flaunt the very arrogance that had made him careless. Then, almost casually, I mentioned the overdue rent and the notices that had arrived, phrased as curiosity rather than accusation. "Oh, really?" one cousin asked, eyebrows raising. "I thought everything was fine with your apartment." My brother stammered, laughed nervously, trying to explain it away, but each word only highlighted his negligence. "It's just a mistake," he muttered, glancing around, hoping someone would rescue him. I watched the color drain from his face as others started piecing it together. The air shifted. Murmurs floated across the table, subtle judgment layering over disbelief. Every glance toward me felt like a reward, a quiet acknowledgement that the sibling he had dismissed as pathetic now had the power to expose his flaws. Inside, I was a storm of satisfaction and reflection, marveling at how the smallest truth could dismantle the fortress he had built around his pride. The irony was delicious. He had spent years trying to assert dominance, while I, silently underestimated, orchestrated the moment that left him publicly vulnerable. As he fumbled for words, I realized the effect of observation and patience, of quiet strategy over loud confrontation. The humiliation was complete, and I felt a profound sense of equilibrium settling over me. For once, the world saw him as he truly was, imperfect, flawed, and far from untouchable. And yet, even as I reveled in the moment, I knew the story wasn't over. Something bigger was coming, and the suspense of what he might do next lingered like a pulse in the room, unbroken. The fallout was swift, sharper than I had even imagined. Within days, word of my brother's missed payments and frantic mismanagement spread beyond our family circle. Friends, neighbors, and mutual acquaintances began asking questions, their polite concern laced with barely concealed judgment. Invitations he once took for granted suddenly seemed contingent, polite smiles masking subtle ridicule. He tried to recover, of course, excuses, deflections, and desperate attempts at charm. But every effort only reminded everyone of the precarious position he had created for himself. I watched from a distance, calm, composed, savoring the contrast between his flustered desperation and my quiet stability. There was no gloating, no dramatics, just the steady awareness that he had underestimated me, dismissed me, and now faced consequences he couldn't charm away. Karma had unfolded elegantly, almost imperceptibly at first, but unmistakable in its impact. As I observed the cracks in his pride, the whispers behind his back, the social slights he had never before experienced, I felt a wave of vindication. The sibling who had called me pathetic, who had cast me aside without a second thought, was now humbled, exposed in ways he couldn't control. And yet, amidst the satisfaction, I felt a deeper lesson crystallize. Justice wasn't loud or vengeful. It was measured, precise, and inevitable when patience met opportunity. He would remember this, perhaps not with gratitude, but with understanding that the underestimated sibling could quietly turn the tables, transforming humiliation into a subtle but undeniable triumph. Sitting alone that evening, I felt a strange mixture of relief and quiet pride. The tension that had shadowed every family gathering, every conversation, every glance I exchanged with my brother, had finally eased. I realized that the satisfaction I felt wasn't just about exposing his flaws or forcing him to confront the consequences of his arrogance. It was about reclaiming my own sense of self-worth. For years, I had let his dismissals, his favoritism, and his sneers define me, bending my behavior and my confidence to fit the mold he created. Now, I understood that empowerment didn't come from defeating someone else in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It came from recognizing my boundaries, honoring my intelligence, and asserting my presence quietly but decisively. Our family dynamics would never be perfect. Old wounds, biases, and resentments lingered like shadows. But I had created balance where imbalance had ruled for so long. I had shown myself, and indirectly the world, that being underestimated was not a weakness, but a tool. I had learned that patience, observation, and strategic action could turn humiliation into triumph, silence into influence, and rejection into strength. As I reflected, a small, knowing smile crept across my face, the kind that comes when you've survived, learned, and quietly won. In the end, I realized something important. You don't have to scream to be heard, and the most satisfying victories are often the ones others never see coming. Months passed, and life unfolded in ways that felt both ordinary and quietly extraordinary. I returned to my routines, to work, to the small victories that had once gone unnoticed, but everything now carried a new weight of confidence. My brother's missteps had become a cautionary tale in subtle whispers at family events, while I remained calm, measured, and almost invisible, yet undeniably in control. Friends and distant relatives began noticing changes, curious about my quiet composure, the way I seemed unshakable, even when chaos surrounded me. Opportunities I had once been too timid to pursue now presented themselves, and I approached them with the same patience and strategy I had applied to him. There was a thrill in knowing I had the foresight and prudence to act without fanfare, to plan in silence, and to reap the rewards over time. I couldn't predict every outcome, nor did I want to. The uncertainty added a delicious edge, a subtle FOMO that kept those around me wondering what I might do next. And as I looked ahead, I realized that this was just the beginning. My victories were no longer about revenge. They were about mastering life on my own terms, quietly, brilliantly, and with the knowledge that being underestimated was my greatest advantage.